We begin our show with the Australian Prime Minister. Turnbull is preparing for high-level talks with President Trump in Washington, D.C. later this week. This coincides with a plan reported by the Australian Financial Review on Monday, citing a senior U.S. official saying Australia, the United States, India, and Japan are looking at a joint regional infrastructure plan as an alternative to China's multi-billion-dollar Belt and Road Initiative in an attempt to counter so-called China's spreading influence. Will the U.S.-led alternative to China's Belt and Road plan pan out? Before our discussion, take a look at this.
Okay. Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull will visit Washington, D.C. later this week. He's expected to discuss with the U.S. President, Donald Trump, a joint infrastructure financing plan reported by the Australian Financial Review. The report said Australia, India, Japan, and the U.S. are seeking to establish a regional infrastructure scheme that's an alternative to Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has an official response.
We hope that all sides could strengthen relevant international cooperation in the spirit of openness, inclusiveness, and win-win cooperation, in order to promote regional cooperation and global economic development and to benefit people around the world.
Washington has adopted the concept of an Indo-Pacific strategy. It was mentioned in the Trump administration's first national defense strategy, released in January, which identifies China as the biggest strategic competitor to the U.S. Mr. Turnbull's visit to the U.S. will celebrate the 100 years of friendship between Australia and the U.S.
The United States is re-evaluating its foreign policy priorities, especially in Asia. It's recently launched both the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy, and they outline a much more competitive US-China relationship. And Australia is seen as a key part of the US push in Asia.
A U.S. official did say the four-way cooperation was not a rival to the Belt and Road Initiative, and the cooperation plan was still nascent. A Japanese official also said four countries regularly exchanging views is hardly an alternative to the Belt and Road. Could talks between Mr. Trump and Mr. Turnbull give the plan enough boost to get off the ground?
What shall we expect from the meeting between the Australian Prime Minister and the U.S. President? Will the U.S.-led so-called alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative pan out? We are joined in the studio here in Beijing by Mr. Wang Yiwei, who is a Jean Monnet Chair Professor at Renmin University. He has been an expert for China's plan on Belt and Road Initiative. Professor Wang, great to have you here. Also joining us, we would like to welcome Mr. Gregory McCarthy, who is the BHP Billiton Chair of Australian Studies at Peking University. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
And joining us in Washington, D.C., Joe Rubin, the President of Washington Strategy Group, who's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Mr. Rubin, welcome as well. I want to start with you, Professor McCarthy. So, mateship. That was the word being used once and again when the Australian Prime Minister was describing the relationship between Australia and the United States. Help us understand, coming not from down under, exactly what it meant.
Mateship's one of those historic words that Australians use. I suppose the equivalent in Australia would be, you know, a notion of a comrade, someone who you're very friendly with and can share ideas with and share cultures and emotions. So if there is equivalent, it's a comrade. And mateship goes back a long way to the notion that Australia and America were mates during the Second World War.
Right.
Then
in fact, 100 years.
100 years, definitely 100 years, and it was followed through with all the way with LBJ, the notion that we were all the way with America. And then it's come all the way forward, if you like, with John Howard and George W. Bush being very close as mates, and Julie Gillard and Obama being mates.
So that, in a way, is about sustaining a so-called history of allyship, in a way, friendship.
Friendship and allyship, yes.
There we go. Mr. Rubin, though, from the United States, I see American press been using that word a lot with the quote mark. How does Washington see that mateship?
Well, thank you for having me. The United States clearly values Australia. There really is zero political conflict over the American relationship with Australia. It's a very close intelligence partner, economic partner. We're the largest investor in Australia. Australia it sends its largest investments overseas to the United States. So Australia is a key partner, and there were deep concerns here in Washington about a year ago when President Trump and the Prime Minister had a very contentious phone call that apparently the President described as his worst phone call, worse than his call with Vladimir Putin. So that created concerns because the U.S. does depend on Australia in Asia as a key ally and a bulwark related to China in terms of our trade in the region. So hopefully this visit will smooth that out and set us on a different path than has been perceived in the past year.
Will it, Mr. McCarthy, what exactly is the plan in the notebook of Australia?
Well, I think the plan for the notebook of Australia is to try and get America continue to be engaged in Asia. Australia is concerned maybe with the rise of China being so rapid and so large that it wants America to be engaged. It wants America to maybe to rethink its position on the TPP. It wants it involved with multilateral trade arrangements, and it's concerned that America pulled out. It's concerned that America might be moving away from a rules-based order, which Australia has expected and America has led, because Trump's moved both away from multilateral agreements and the notion of a rules-based order, which Australia's looked at.
Yeah.
And therefore Australia went to Japan to try and encourage Japan to get Trump to be engaged again as well.
So, a lot of things on the agenda, but Professor Wang, I have to invite you in because both sides earlier have already mentioned China repeatedly in their answers about bilateral relations. Exactly how does China see its neighbors, I mean, at least from the south, looking at its allyship with the United States? I want to continue that quote once again. Make sure.
Actually, Australia's Foreign Minister argued before that Australia, even the allies of the United States, can be also a partner of China, not just necessary to make a choice between economically more linked with China, security more linked to the United States.
Okay, well, it's coming from the foreign minister. I mean, that could be diplomatic enough, right? You know that, Professor
But actually,
Wang. And there we go. I mean, you think about that. I mean, how could China be the largest trading partner of Australia? Well, Australia is having a very different strategic plan toward China vis-a-vis the United States. And will China want that to happen? I mean, on the one hand, you hand out this branch leave to Australia with money and trade and possible exchanges. On the other hand, Australia do not regard you as someone who could be close, but rather someone who is afar, and therefore using the United States against China. Can China accept that?
No, against China, I think want to balance, definitely, because Australia very worried about too much rely on Chinese economy. They worry about the economic linkage will be sooner or later put Australia strategically, politically more close to China, which definitely some conservative Australians may be worried about that. They don't trust Communist Party, they don't trust so much about China future. And we understand that Australia as a trade country, they cannot provide the safety of their trade sea line, so they rely on the United States. So nearly all their trade countries rely on the United States, except China.
So China totally accepts what is going on right now? Is
no,
that what you're
not
saying?
accept. We understand, but not accept. We hope Australia will be a positive engagement both with China and the United States, and not make troubles between each other.
Trouble? Exactly what does that mean in China's dictionary?
Some Chinese are very worried about that Australia, Japan works too closely, want to hate China or even push U.S. back, and that's understandable, but more focus on the security.
Okay, focus on the
China
security,
Sea.
South China Sea. Mr. Rubin, help us to understand here. South China Sea has also been mentioned in United States white paper about the security and also strategy as well. So how does the U.S. on the one hand work with China while knowing the rise of China today? On the other hand, build its Warwick in a way with its allies in the region. against China or against a potential threat of China. How does that work?
This has been a tension point that has been unresolved, not only in this administration, but also in the Obama administration and earlier in the Bush administration. And President Obama devised a strategy that sought to essentially engage through economic statecraft, through trade agreements, the allies of the United States outside surrounding China through the TPP, not necessarily as an anti-China maneuver, but certainly as one to re-exert American leadership in the region. And that was the objective. And at the same time, with the South China Sea, sending strong signals, not military signals specifically, but very strong words and rhetoric about China's military not going further into the South China Sea.
Right.
So we've seen that strategy, however, fall apart in this administration. There is no trade vision for the United States in Asia, and that has left our allies vulnerable and, in a sense, looking for a new partner. And my fear is that our current policy is handing those relationships over to China on economic cooperation, and at the same time, the idea of increasing belligerence and military activity with China is completely counterproductive, particularly with North Korea as an issue where we need to cooperate with China.
All right.
But the rhetoric coming from the White House seems to default to that as well. So I'm not clear where the strategy is heading as we compare it to.
I feel so relieved, Mr. Rubin, when you say you do not know where the direction is, because I am actually getting really confused right now about that, Professor Wang. I might have to come back to you about that. I mean, is the United States handing over the beautiful hands of its allies all to China's face?
It's hard to say.
It's hard to say.
From the Chinese side, I think we're very worried about Australia provide more military access to United States in the name of China's threat in the South China Sea, whatever. Actually, South China Sea issues now come down better situation, and then because of the Australia, Japan, the United States, now even India join, Australia will take use of the so-called Indo-Pacific, and then to show the importance to the United States, Australia's position strategically, and then make more troubles at the cost of our relations with China. So that's China very concerned about that.
All right. But on the other hand, Professor McCarthy, the South China Sea issue, as Professor Wang just mentioned, calmed down somewhat already last year. The question is, will that become once again a hot issue? And secondly, it is not just about the South China Sea security issue anymore. It is also about something bigger. For example, China's originally proposal of Belt and Road Initiative, which is not a plan about China, but rather China considered it a plan about partners China could have with the rest of the world. So, Professor McCarthy, what exactly are we talking about? Is it the South China Sea, that little issue itself, or is it about an overall world vision about how relationship will go in this critical juncture, Professor McCarthy?
I think it's a larger question. I think the South China Sea is used often as the notion that China is a new aggressive power, and that it's an expansionary power like old empires. So that's one of the metaphors that's used, and so it's a small island issue, but it's a large metaphor. And that relates to the issue of what is the Belt and Road? Is it an economic strategy, or is it an economic and security strategy?
What do you think?
Well, the
We got the expert coming from China.
Yes.
Professor Wang been talking about that a lot, so maybe you guys can do some exchange right here.
So the issue, as Mr. Rubin sort of pointed out, the issue in general is that it can be both. And the trouble with when you do the Belt and Road and you look across the countries that it's getting involved with, that Australia is kind of thinking about with India, is that you've got this India-China tension, so that's an old issue. You've got the tension between Pakistan, United States, and India that has a difficulty for Australia to work out. So if we want a quad that builds around hedging against China for really supposedly economic reasons, but for strategic reasons, and there's every justification for Australia to try to have a hedge both economically and strategically, but it's complicated.
Yeah, it seems Professor McCarthy has been suggesting, Mr. Rubin, that there are those problems that people or different countries could have and had with China. Will those sporadic problems, when linked up together, become a much bigger issue and become an alliance relationship of somewhat that would contain in those countries' eyes of China? So, Mr. Rubin, can you help us to understand, do you think those issues would work, quote unquote, together?
Well, it will be a problem if we don't seize the initiative from an American perspective, if we don't really clarify what our objectives are in the Asia region, what they are in South Asia, between India and Pakistan as a subset of challenges there. And if we don't really make it clear about what our economic vision is, you know, essentially for the past several decades, the economic growth of the Asia region has been a driver of economic activity in the United States and globally, and its prosperity benefits us all. And for much of that time, the United States policy community has been looking at Asia as an economic issue, of course with China and security issues in the background. And so we need to make sure that we don't lose that line of thinking at this current moment. And with the collapse of the TPP, it really left a vacuum on the question of what our economic relationship will be with Asia. And I think until we can make that clear from an American perspective as to what we're trying to do, all these sort of ad hoc arrangements with countries with whom we already have great economic relations, with Australia and Japan, India, we're already there. A new ad hoc arrangement, a sort of brick for Asia compared to in South America where there are ad hoc economic arrangements, that's not really going to cut it. That's not really a comprehensive, clear vision of what we're trying to achieve. And that then creates an opportunity for other tensions to rise on the security front.
Professor, coming back to you, Professor McCarthy, what about that so-called alternative? That was Australian media quoting, I identified a senior U.S. official suggesting there is a possibility of alternative toward the Belt and Road Initiative that could be built by the four countries, namely India, Australia, Japan, the United States. So what is that alternative going to be like?
Well, Rome wasn't built in a day. I think the problem is that we don't quite know what it is, and that's what is the issue. I think Rubin put it very clearly, that the issue that Mr. Rubin pointed out is that we don't know what that looks like. It's very complicated. It's a starting phrase to try and hedge against China, but it doesn't look to me to be sustainable or even got off the ground. Well, you've got so much differences between those countries, and that Australia has got every right to try and balance China against those countries to find some balance for its own national interest. But in general, at the moment, Australia is caught for very much the point. We don't know what that would look like, we don't know where America is going, and so we're trying to encourage America to come back economically to balance the security. I
was doing a little research, Professor, right before coming into the studio, and got to know a little bit more about so-called alternative. According to, quote, senior unidentified U.S. officials, that works like this, the alternative. That is, China is building ports. Okay, those ports is not going to be commercially viable. But the United States, India, Japan, and Australia will come in and build roads, which are commercially viable, and therefore will become the alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. Okay, if that is the explanation, I want to come back to you, Professor Wang. Why would China be so stupid, building something that is not commercially viable, while leaving all the spaces to the others to build something that is commercially viable? It's just very funny to me. But Professor, putting the funny thing aside, what can China do to incorporate all these players, regional, international, into further this plan, which is Belt and Road Initiative, if we are talking about common interests here?
Well, it's funny because originally the West used alternative to China model to challenge so-called universal values. But now they use the alternative. It means they are defensive. China is more offensive, actually.
A lot of terminology is going on over here.
But this, I think, indeed identified that the Belt and Road Initiative pointed the right direction for cooperation because it focused on the real economy, infrastructure building, which the world needs very much. So China, I think, is very welcome of that. It's not challenging of that.
So Australia should join?
Australia
should join?
is in
India should join? And the United States should join?
We welcome all these stakeholders to be the stakeholder of the Belt and Road. Actually, Australia is the South Pacific. You are play the leading role in the Belt and Road Initiative in the Maritime Silk Road.
Right.
It's no problem. We need more capital. We needed to connect it to all existing and the future infrastructure. So Belt and Road Initiative will focus on the mutual connectivity. We don't worry about you have your initiative, alternative of that. We try to combine all this together. This is
Some suggest the reason why these four countries...
Can I add?
Please go ahead, Mr. Rubin.
Can I add on this? I mean, I really need to make sure also that the reality of the situation in Washington is that the Trump administration is significantly cutting our development assistance dollars by about 30% in its request for this coming year. So, as we say here, put your money where your mouth is, and funding for development is going down and defense is going up. So I'm not sure where the money would come from even for an initiative like that if there ever were to be one. It doesn't seem like this administration is committed in financial terms to that kind of a vision.
Very interesting over there as well. We have only 1 minute left. Time is short when the discussion is going so well. Before we go, gentlemen, what can we expect? What do you think is the right and the smart strategy from your own country's perspective? One sentence from every one of you. Let's go with Joe Rubin, coming from the U.S.
The smart strategy is to get everyone in the room and have a real comprehensive discussion about the future of Asia and America's ability to engage all the different players.
Professor McCarthy, coming from Australia.
I think Australia has to balance the US and China relationship in a way that gives its own national interest a potential to come through and not take sides.
The thing is, how is that balance going to be kept?
Okay.
And finally, last but not least, Professor Wang Yiwei, coming from China.
Inclusiveness. The Belt and Road Initiative focus on inclusive globalization, not alliance, to put somebody aside, and then I think that's the key.
All right. With that word, I guess we can all go back home and have a great weekend. For now, I want to thank the three of you, Wang Yiwei, Gregory McCarthy, and Joe Rubin. Really appreciate